Emily, welcome to the Women Going Big podcast. I am so excited to have you on. I'm super looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today. I do have your bio pulled up, but I always love hearing from my guest about I like hearing your story from yourself. But before that, we dive right in here. So, Emily, how are you going big?
So I am breaking generational trauma cycles within my own family, and I'm helping other mamas do the same.
Obviously, that is not a light topic at all, but I think that it's something that is being talked about more, and people are aware that trauma can be a lot of different things, and that it isn't just, the things that people naturally think about. Trauma could be a lot of different things. So with that, I would love to hear more about your story, kind of what set you on that path, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, okay. So I had a tremendously traumatic childhood. And I guess before we get too far into that, I want to make sure that our listeners understand what trauma is. So oftentimes we think that trauma is the events that happened. So the abuse itself, or the neglect, or the car accident, or whatever it might be. But the event itself is not the trauma. The trauma is what you make that event mean about you. The story the narrative that you play in your mind about what that event means about you. So the facts of my childhood: my mom abandoned me when I was 6 or 7 months old. I was raised primarily by my paternal grandparents. When I was 5 or 6, I think I was 6, my dad got married to a woman who had a son of her own. And at that point in my life, I was really close with my dad. So I wanted to go live with my dad. And I lived there for about 18 months, and during which time I was abused in all of the ways. So physically, emotionally, sexually, all of the ways. And I wasn't allowed to stay home on weekends. I had to go other places because my stepmom didn't want anything to do with me. She didn't want to see me. And so one Sunday evening in November of 97, I was at my biological mom's house, and something clicked inside of me when she told me to go get my stuff ready, that it was time for me to go home. And I said, I made a decision. So I went in my half-sister's room, got my stuff together, and tried to figure out a plan for not going home. So my little malnourished 7-year-old self got under my sister's desk in the chair hole and put my bag in front of me so that nobody could see me. And I sat there, and people came in looking for me, and I did not answer. It was a while until my mom noticed that my bag was sitting there on the floor in the chair hole. She moved it and found little Emily. And she goes, "What's going on?" I said, "I'm not going home." So that night I went back to live with my paternal grandparents, and life went back to quote unquote normal. And then through my older elementary years, my middle school years, high school, and university, I struggled with anxiety and depression because I was taught in my family that we don't talk about those things. We don't talk about the emotions. But if you're not talking about it, if you're repressing all of your emotions, it's going to come out in some way, shape, or form. And for me, that was anxiety and depression, which we also don't talk about. So fast forward to my early 20s, I decided that I was going to move across Canada. So I grew up in Nova Scotia. I moved across the country to Alberta to pursue a education career and met the man that is now my husband. I didn't want to have children. He wanted to have 3. So we compromised and we had 1. And that was our goal, was to let's have 1 and we'll see how it goes. That was incredibly challenging. I dealt with some infertility, and that led to doctor's appointments and whatnot. And I dealt with a lot of medical gaslighting, medical manipulation, to the point where I fired the OBGYN that I was seeing because of her lack of compassion in the midst of a miscarriage, and took my health into my own hands. And through that, I became connected with a really great naturopath who explained to me how my years of trauma in my childhood was impacting my life now and causing all sorts of problems that I was dealing with, including the infertility. So he gave me the tools so that my body could be nurtured and heal enough to establish pregnancy. And so my daughter that pregnancy was healthy, normal. She was born in September of 2018. And the challenge that I faced up to that point was just the beginning, because she came out looking like baby Emily, which is insanely adorable in my biased opinion, but also incredibly triggering. And so my fight or flight response was on, and it was telling me to run, get the heck out of here, it's not safe. Meanwhile, I knew cognitively that if I did that, I was going to repeat the cycle. That was abandoning my baby and my husband, and that's not what I wanted to do. So I knew I had 2 choices. I could listen to that voice that was telling me to run, or I could stay and face it. And I chose to stay and face it, and those were some really dark days. And I pleaded with God. I said, God, if you will help me get through this, if you will bring me to the other side of this, when I get to the other side, I will reach my hand back into the fire, because I know that I'm not the only woman, the only mama dealing with these things. I know there are lots of kids like me who are now trying to be parents who don't know how to do it and are struggling because their nervous system just can't handle it. So that's the beginning of my journey, and it's been 5.5 years of a lot of hard work.
Yeah. Wow. You said about 5.5 years of working through this, a lot of hard work. What was, and it's hard to pinpoint this, right? But what would you consider the first step in realizing that you wanted to face this? Because for a lot of people, I don't have babies yet, but one thing for me that I have to really consider is this something that I want? So for anybody out there that's on the fence and maybe has previous trauma that they know they have to face, what would you say is the first step in helping you, I don't want to say accept it, but realize that the path to move forward is, I don't want to say the right one, but to break the cycle, you have to move forward. So what would you say that first step looks like or could look like?
For me, the first step was acknowledging that I either needed to face it, which was big and scary, or I was going to listen to that voice. And so when I chose to stay and face it, I knew that I couldn't do it alone. So community became critical, and not just any community, a community of mamas who have been doing the healing work. They understand the challenges of doing motherhood, mamahood as I refer to it, with the added challenges of navigating trauma, of understanding that when your child triggers you, you're not responding to your child. You're responding to an emotion that is calling to be dealt with from your childhood. That community is the make or break component, I think, outside of your decision and your determination to overcome this mountain, because that community is able to uphold you and support you on those days that are inevitably going to be a bad day. Because healing is not a destination, it is a journey, and it's not linear. So sometimes it does feel like you take 3 steps forward and 5 steps back, but it's all worth it. And sometimes you have to address something more than once before you've worked all the way through it. I think to answer your question, acknowledging it, acknowledging where you're at, making a decision, and then finding your support, because you're not meant to do it alone.
What did that look like for you when you made the conscious decision? You know, you had mentioned your fight or flight coming in really hot when you looked at your baby for the first time, but what did that first step look like for you? Like, what was the first thing that you're like, I know I'm going to face this, but now what? What was that? What was that next step for you?
I needed to find a therapist who was able to help me discern where I started and stopped, and where my biological mom stopped, and where my daughter started. Because for me, the lines were blurred. And I thought that because my biological mom made the choices that she made in 1990, that I was stuck in that cycle in 2018. When very clearly I was not. And I'm my own person. My daughter is also not me. So discerning those boundaries was huge for me.
Obviously, we are our own person, but my immediate thought goes to how many women are walking around with extensions of their mother's, their grandmother's trauma, and not even realizing that those parts of themselves are shaping decisions in their current life right now. Like, that is, I don't know if you like men's Roman empires, that is like one of mine. It's something I think about all the time, but do you have any thoughts on that for women that don't even know they're carrying that with them?
In the families that I've been a part of, we tend to take on how our previous generations have done something just because that's the way it's always been. And it's, in a way, very thoughtless. Like, why do you carve the turkey that way? Like, that's a really random example, but like, why does grandpa always need to carve the turkey? And I don't know, that's just how it's always been. So I think a lot of the work that our generation is doing now is about coming into a more conscious way of living and actually critically thinking about why things are the way they are. And if we don't like it, we change it, right? Just because Great Uncle Mo did something a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way. And if we stop doing it that way, it doesn't mean that we disrespect him. It's just things have changed over time.
I totally agree with that. And something else, too, that I'm curious about, because it takes a lot of awareness, right, to kind of look inside yourself and be like, I don't like the way that this is being done, or even enough awareness to question yourself of, why am I doing it this way? Like, was I taught this? Like, where did this action thought come from? Do you think that there's any tools or anything that you would recommend for women who wouldn't even know where to start as far as that awareness goes? Because that's like a muscle, right? Like, awareness is a muscle we have to build. What would you recommend for somebody that is maybe just starting to have those thoughts and isn't even sure where to start looking inside themselves to find those answers or questions?
Start with allowing yourself to journal it out or practice a mindful breathing technique. Like, when you sit down to a journal, however you choose to journal, because there are 1,001 ways to journal, doing it without judging yourself with whatever comes out. Just practice allowing yourself. And at first, when you first start, you might have blank pages, and that's okay. Let it be okay. And just allow yourself to write whatever thought comes to mind. For me, I take my mind out of the equation and I just write. When I get a pen and notebook in hand, I just write. And sometimes I read back what I've written and the tears just start flowing. And that's huge, because those tears are healing. So often in our society, we associate tears with weakness. And that's how I thought of tears. Like, I can't cry because then I'm weak. But tears have a place, and they are a very healing and cleansing thing. They have a purpose.
And I so agree with that. I think I learned that I started on like a meditation and yoga journey several years ago. I think at least 2 or 3 now. And I remember the first time that I full on bawled after my yoga class. And I was raised in the same boat. Like, tears are a sign of weakness. And for the first time, I was okay with it in front of a bunch of people that I didn't know, but it felt healing. It was the very first time that I was able to sit in those feelings and understand that whatever was happening in my body, something was being healed. And it was amazing. The difference is amazing when you can sit back and separate the fact that I don't need to be ashamed of this. This is my body healing myself.
Yeah, it's huge.
What is something, if you could shout from the rooftops and you could reach 1 million women who were struggling with, essentially recovering from working through their trauma, what would you say to them?
Your trauma doesn't define you, and healing is possible.
And how powerful is that? We're kind of getting towards the end of the interview here, but I checked out your website or your Instagram before the interview. It looks like you have a lot of really big things going on. What is a really big goal that you have in the next 3 to 5 years? What is something that may seem insurmountable that you hope to achieve or that you're working on?
So my big dream is opening a holistic women's clinic that supports trauma survivors in a holistic way, because your trauma is not just emotional or psychological. It affects your whole being. And women deal with so much medical gaslighting, it's not even funny. So my dream is to open a holistic women's clinic that also has a safe house for women escaping domestic violence.
I think it's so needed. I'm looking forward to following your journey and watching that happen for you. Now, at the end of the conversation, I do always allow my guests to make sure if there's anything that came up in the conversation that you're still chewing on or thinking about, that you have an opportunity to bring that up. So is there anything else that you want our audience to know, or that you've had kind of floating around that you'd like to chat about before we wrap up?
Just give yourself grace. When you enter into motherhood and you are a survivor of childhood trauma and your nervous system has been trained in your childhood that chaos is the norm, or loud noises are super triggering for you, allow yourself the grace to learn how to cope with that in a healthy way, because you were not given the roadmap for healthy relationships. You were given the quite opposite. And so when you choose to heal, and it is a choice, you have to give yourself grace and understand that it's not going to happen overnight, but it is worth it.
I think that's a great way to kind of wrap this up. I do love that you mentioned that it's a choice, and it's a long road. It takes a lot of work, and it's not something that happens overnight. But I think that when you make the decision that these choices and the way my life is not necessarily the way that I would have chosen, it's been shaped by actions of things that have happened to me, I think there's power in that. So I love that you are in a place where you're helping women move through that. So very powerful stuff. All right, with that, so we'll go ahead and wrap up the show. If women loved what they heard today, and I know they will because I did, where can they connect with you, and what do you have to offer women going through this, and where can they find more resources?
So if you are a mama who is just getting started, or you're thinking about becoming a mama, you can follow me on Instagram, emily.cleghorn.coach. You can also find me on my podcast, the Mamahood After Trauma podcast, and I do have a few episodes of prenatal or things that you can do before you become a mama. And I also offer one-to-one coaching. So right now I have 5 spots available for one-to-one coaching at amazing pricing. I don't think you will find one-to-one coaching this cheap anywhere else. You can find all of that on my website, home.mendedmamalife.ca.
And all of those links will be in the show notes, so I will make sure that they get posted there. If you want more information, you can head over there to get those. And Emily, thank you so much for sharing your story and coming on the show today. I love how you're going big, and I love how you're helping other women go big and work through trauma in their life. And yeah, I really appreciate you being on the show today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody else, we will see you next time.